See if it shuts down correctly this time.
Hebrews. Hebrew. Moving through. All right, remember, pistis. We're in the pistis chapter. Pistis is a word that continually means to be persuaded or have been persuaded. Pistis. But here's the fun words. Okay, I'll do K, I guess. Kataskopous. 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 Kata down. Scopus. What scopus mean? Scopus from skeptomai, skeptic. To peer about. Well, not exactly a skeptic per se. Peer about. From scapo, meaning to dig. To dig. Skeptic. To dig. Meaning concealment. And the word, okay, in Greek is a reconnoiterer. So you're kataskopos, down scopus. You're
Spy.
You're spy. Yeah, spy. Translated into King James as spy, but it's a reconnoiter. So a scout, right? Remember how I told you? Okay. So we're writing. The writers appear to be writing to Romans, Greeks, Hebrews, Egyptians, and primarily in that group of Hebrews to Jews, let's say, is you have 5 sects, and in those sects is Teen Hodos. The way. The path, the way. So, remember I told you? Okay. So, who do you remember from those Alexandrian groups? As a matter of fact, we had old Peter going to one of those guys. Remember that? Peter was brought to Cornelius' house, and Cornelius was a Roman centurion. And what we know about this period, okay, remember, this stuff is so deep. It's deep, but it's not, it's known to everybody who was reading these documents or who was hearing these documents, but it's not known to us. Kurios, the word that made our word church, kurios. Kurios is the word that is applied to Mithras and to Mithran worship. And we know that every early church where was every early church? Underground, right? Underground. As a matter of fact, in the churches, especially after there was a purge by Nero before 70 AD, in which Soitanus, right? Soitanus, like the Three Stooges. Soitanus says that they kicked all the Mysterions out of Rome, including the Mysterion of that guy Christus. So we know by the time of Nero and Soitanus, Christianity, Teen Hodos, was already in Rome. And what they were doing is they were meeting in especially the Mithran Kurios. And for some reason, the Mithran Kurios thought it was really cool. Does anyone know what was the main worshippers of Mithras? The military. Yes, the Roman legions were for some reason, they were really attracted to Mithran worship. Not sure why. The Mithran worship was really close to the to some of the Teen Hodos ideas, right? Repentance. Well, if we were to write out all the stuff that Mysterions did, the list would look just like our church. Even though Christianity is not a Mysterion, it looks like a Mysterion. That's what Paul played on all the time. So the Mysterion of Mithras was really attractive to the Roman legions. Now, isn't it interesting? Well, there's a reason for this word, and we'll see why. But I pointed out to you before other words that were really, that were obviously military words that came from the Latin into the Greek. This is a purely Greek word meaning a scout. But I just want to point out to you, it's interesting that we see these a spy, if I were, and I don't off the hand know what the word for spy is in Greek, right? But spy is not necessarily a military term, is it? But a scout or a reconnoiterer is. You see what I'm saying? But yet the context of the word that we're going to have is exactly that. A scout or a spy. We'll see the context. It's kind of fun. Okay, this one is S-U-N-A-P-O-L-E-T-O. So, sun apoleto. Sun means together. Together. Sune, right? Synagogue, together. Brought together. Apoleto. This is a word, okay. Apo is off. And this is that word olithros. Remember last week we had the word olumi, to destroy. To destroy, we had the word, this word in context means to destroy. And I told you, but that's not the word that you see usually in the Greek, right? You see this, apoleto. So it's a form of this word. And then together, this means to destroy together. And I told you that this word is used contextually usually about people, and this word is used contextually usually about stuff or things. But we see this word, apoleto, used almost all the time in the Greek. So remember, I told you, I think it's very interesting that you see these forms, right? And see how they're used within the context of the words. So with this in mind and beginning, so the first, I got to remind you, the first verse, but persuasion stands under expectation of proof of deeds not seen. And the second verse, assigning a reason, in this the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness. And I want to remind you the word witness is martyrios, is martyr. Martyrios in Greek. So keep that in mind, because when we get to the end of the chapter, if you haven't read there already, you'll see exactly how this context fits. And so where we are is we were at 30, and we had just translated. So I'm going to read we had already translated 30. I'll read it in the NIV. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. And the translation of this, the literal of this was persuaded the walls of Jericho flew down and circled 7 days. The translation is the walls of Jericho were persuaded to fly down when encircled for 7 days. And I told you to contemplate who persuaded. And then I said, okay, these people in this time are... You always start with animism. Animism. We go to pantheonic paganism and to Mysterion and then to Gnosticism. This is the way that this is what we call the evolution of religion in human thinking. The only two that aren't like this is Christianity and Judaism, because Christianity looks like a Mysterion. Judaism doesn't look like anything like this at all. Judaism, if anything, in its practical sense, looks similar to a Mysterion in some ways, right? Because it has a mikvah, a baptism, right? It has a meal, the sacrificial meal. Unfortunately, what happened to Judaism is Judaism lost its context in with the destruction of the temple. Is there any more sacrifice in Judaism?
No.
What did Teen Hodos do?
Eliminated the need.
All except the sacrifice of thanksgiving.
They didn't eliminate it. They carried it on in a means that we call the Eucharist, right? But they carried it on, right? Where what did Judaism do? They don't do it at all anymore. They completely got rid of the sacrifice. The difference then Judaism looks a little bit like a mysterion, especially when you're sacrificing, right? The minute you stop sacrificing, it no longer looks like a mysterion. You can't do a meal with the deity anymore. This is very interesting, isn't it? This is probably the greatest split between Teen Hodos and Judaism, because Teen Hodos is a sect of Judaism, was that one continued the Thanksgiving sacrifice because they felt it was necessary. The other completely went away from the sacrifice. And what's even more interesting is, look at what do Messianic Jews do?
They continue with the Thanksgiving sacrifice.
They continue with the Thanksgiving sacrifice. Matter of fact, I can't remember. I wish Dave Norris was here. Dave Norris goes routinely to a lot of their things, and I can't remember if I participated in a Eucharistic or communion service with the Messianic Jews here in our community. I don't know if they have open or closed communion or what they do. I don't remember being in a communion thing. But I've been to some of their stuff. They have a really fun and different kind of approach to their Christianity. Is a mixture of Judaism and what we would call normative Christianity. But they retain a lot of the Jewish flavor to their stuff. Yes, sir?
Why did they go get away from the sacrifices? And after they did it, how did the priests eat?
Number one, there's no priests anymore.
Okay.
The priesthood exists, and everyone that calls themselves Cohen or any form of Cohen is either intentionally or for real. Remember I told you when they came back from Babylon, there's a lot of people named Cohen. No one had last names in the old days, right? But Cohen is a title meaning priest in Hebrew. So the priesthood was destroyed when the temple was destroyed, pretty much. Except what we've been saying, remember? There was a temple in Alexandria, right? The two temples, there was originally more than two, but in this period there are two temples. So all the priests, if they could, you see there's a theological problem. Where's the only place you can sacrifice? In the temple in Jerusalem, right? So John Chrysostom, I can't exactly remember, but it's about 300 AD. John Chrysostom, about 300 AD, created the Christian Mass. The Teen Hodos Mass, if you like, the Christian Mass. And in the Christian Mass, he developed all the Eucharistic stuff we do. Go look at how the Orthodox Church does it. They do the 6-hour Mass, the 3-hour Mass. Everybody else has abbreviated that Mass. It's the same Mass. They use the same words. They use similar prayers. The Orthodox do a couple of things we don't do. They take the wafer and they take a silver spear, a little miniature spear, and they pierce the wafer, and then they break the wafer. It's all a symbol of the death of Christ on the cross. And then the wine, they pour the wine and they mix it with water. They always mix it with water. In fact, a lot of Orthodox Catholics will usually do that. The Orthodox Church will do it. The Anglicans will do it. They mix the wine with water because the blood of Christ was, right? These are all symbols, and John Chrysostom developed the symbols. The reason John Chrysostom did it is because Paul lost. The original Eucharist was a what?
Passover meal.
It was a Seder. It was a Passover Seder. In the Passover Seder, you took the lamb and you ate the Seder. And we do a Seder at Easter. Tammy does a Seder at Easter. She's a genius with that. Our church will sometimes do a Seder. But in the Seder, you are certain things you go through, right? And you eat the lamb that was sacrificed. You eat the whole thing. We went through that last week, right? Remember the Passover? So you eat that Seder lamb, And Paul said it's okay to eat meat that's sacrificed to idols, right? Which means that everybody in the church, everyone in Teen Hodos could then do a Seder. But we've been talking about that. That was a problem in Hebrews, right? In Hebrews, the temple was destroyed, so they can't do sacrifice anymore, right? And so now they're in Alexandria, and there's a temple in Alexandria. And the writing in Hebrews directly talks about this. They talk about, basically, or say, don't go to the temple and participate because it's not real. It's not the real Seder. It's not the real sacrifice, right? Because it's not Jerusalem. And then they say, don't go sitting in the episynagogue all day just because it's comfortable. The purpose was to go out to others. But at the time, the only way they could do it Paul's way, or they couldn't do it, right? Paul's way was to take the meat sacrificed to idols, or that was killed by a kosher butcher, and then practice the Eucharist. And you remember, I told you, what were they doing every day in Acts until the destruction of the temple? They were sacrificing to get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice. This is really complicated stuff. I'm sorry, I know. We've gone through this before. It's just really complicated stuff. You have the ascension sacrifice. You have the sacrifice for guilt. You have the sacrifice for sin. You have the priest sacrifice. And then you have the Thanksgiving sacrifice. This is done in the temple every day, according to Josephus and according to our biblical sources. This was done for guilt or sin. When you came up to the temple, you would bring a guilt or sin sacrifice, right? The sin one was for known, unintentional sin. The guilt was for unknown, unintentional sin. Was there a sacrifice for intentional sin? Nope. Even the rabbis say there is no sacrifice for intentional sin. The priest sacrifice was grain with a little frankincense and oil on top. They pulled the frankincense and oil and burned it. These were Holocaust sacrifices in general. The Thanksgiving sacrifice is the tithe. The tithe, the 10%. Remember that 10% of the best you're supposed to bring? That is the Thanksgiving sacrifice. You didn't do this was done. Most people would bring something. Everybody would bring their little bit of grain. But then every single person participated in this. That's why Malachi says, don't store it up in your storerooms. Follow the law of God and eat the sacrifice in the temple. In other words, you bring your tithe and you eat the meal with the deity. This is a big deal. You're eating a meal with God. That's what the Eucharist is. We participate in the Eucharist. We believe, we are convinced that we are eating of Christ. Now we know that symbolically, but we also believe that is, we don't believe in transubstantiation. This is historical theology, right? We believe that it becomes the real presence of Christ when it's consumed. So that is what John Chrysostom taught. This allowed everybody in Christianity to participate in the Eucharist without having to sacrifice or eat meat sacrificed to idols. It solved the great problem. This is a problem in Hebrews that they're confronting right now. This is a problem until John Chrysostom. And it's pretty amazing. We're talking right now, this is about, probably 80 AD. I'm going to say, I think this is around 80 AD. It's after the destruction of the temple, probably very close to when they went to Alexandria. They kind of settled down. Things are settling down. So they had to wait another 200 years, 220 years or so, right? To finally get to something that would make everybody happy. You don't hear this about history, right? They didn't write a lot about it. Tertullian and those guys were obviously concerned about it. I mean, the apostolic fathers, the ones in the next generation from, the Bible writers, some of those guys, they are in some Bibles, some collections. But if you read the apostolic fathers, They were concerned about this. This was a huge problem for them. There were some that went on Paul's side. They had a solution. There were some that weren't on Paul's side, and they had no solution. It's difficult stuff. Anyway, so with that, back to the question. Okay, animism. They're animists in pantheonic paganism. Remember I told you, all forces in the world are caused by what?
The gods?
Spirits, the gods. Yeah, in animism, it's spirits. There's spirits. Everything that lives, everything that dies, everything that moves is filled with a spirit. Fire is a spirit. Water, moving, is a spirit. Anything that moves is moved. If a rock falls, it's because a spirit moved it, right? If it grows, it has a spirit. It's a dryad, right? If you take the fruit from a tree, you have to give a sacrifice of some kind, usually a libation. That's why every group, especially the Greeks, the Romans, all those guys, they did libations. A libation to the gods. And by the way, do you remember who is every libation given to first? Hestia. Hestia. The goddess of the hearth is always given the first libation. Yes, sir?
Is a libation the toast, or is it
What they did is every time they drank, especially of wine, but even if you, well, mostly wine, but if you drank or ate anything, you, especially drinking, you would give a libation. So you would tip your cup and just let it dribble. It had to fall on the ground. It had to fall to the dust of the earth, because it was giving back a sacrifice to the spirits, to the gods, for everything you were given. Matter of fact, the Hebrews did the same thing. You know they do, right? It was the tithe. The tithe is the Jewish libation. As a matter of fact, we see that, for example, you know of the baker's tithe, right? What's the baker's tithe?
The 13th dozen, or the 13th?
No, that's good thinking. What they did is, every kosher butcher or baker, when they bake something, they take a thumb-sized piece of dough and they put it into the fire. It's called the baker's libation, but it's the baker's tithe. When they ate something, like especially when they ate food or bread or something, we don't hear much about it because the libations of wine were most common. But you also hear about libations of food. So you take a pinch and you put it in the fire. Obviously, when you put it in the hearth fire, that was for Hestia, right? Hestia always got the first fruits of everything. Very interesting, because Hestia is the goddess of Easter. Very interesting, and the heart. So anyway, the point is this. Okay, so if the walls of Jericho were persuaded and flew down, who persuaded them, and why did they fly down? From our standpoint, God persuaded them. Why did he have to persuade them? If they move, they're full of spirits, right? This isn't our thinking. This is the thinking of the people of the times. That's why it says the walls of Jericho were persuaded to fly down when encircled for 7 days. Because that's, so far our Pistis chapter, right? Our Pistis chapter was about people persuaded. This is now about spirits and gods persuaded. You see this? That's what the author is getting at. It's not just people that were persuaded about God, about what God was doing. It is also the gods are persuaded. And who's in charge? Jehovah Jireh, the God of the Hebrews, is the guy in charge. So much so that he persuaded He persuaded the spirits to throw down the walls of Jericho. Now, like I said, this isn't our thinking, right? This is the thinking of the people of the time. And that's what you gotta wrap your mind around. Because they're not thinking the way we think. They're thinking the way their culture thinks. And that's the whole point of, kind of learning it, seeing how this Greek and history works together. Okay, so Joshua 6, 15 and 20. Jericho tightly shut up because the Israelites, no one went out and came in. And so we go on down. God told them to march around. 14th, on the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to camp. They did this for 6 days. 15, on the seventh day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, the priests sounded the trumpet blast. Joshua commanded people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city and all that's in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction, etc., etc. 20. When the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so every man charged straight in and took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord, destroyed the sword every living thing inside, men, women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. And Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house, bring her out, and all belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that belonged to her. And they brought out her entire family, and they put them in place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, and put the silver and the gold, the articles of bronze, and the iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute and her family, and all belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua sent as spies into Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. At that time Joshua pronounced a solemn oath, cursed before the Lord is the man who undertakes to rebuild the city of Jericho. At the cost of the firstborn son will he lay its foundation. At the cost of the youngest will be set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. Remember, everything is rabbinic context. So the minute that anything is quoted in the New Testament especially, but it's true in the Old Testament too. In the Old Testament, if you see a quote, it's rabbinic context. You need to see the whole thing. Now, I usually don't read the whole thing. I like to read anything that's pertinent, but it's rabbinic context. And you know why it's rabbinic context, right? They didn't have verses and chapters. Yep. And they were mnemonics. So everyone had it memorized. So the minute you said a quote, what did their brains do? They went to the whole context of the verse. You can't help it. You can't help it, right? The minute I say, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, you immediately think of, well, not just John 3:16, you think about, why did Jesus say that? Who did he say it to? Right? He was saying it to the, what's his name? Nicodemus. He said to Nicodemus because he met Nicodemus in the garden at night. And so if, that's our problem. We don't memorize it, right? The way they did. After the mnemonic period, about 600 AD, from about 600 AD, they had begun putting spaces and vowels into the words and began to do the chapter separations around 600 AD. At that point, mnemonics had died pretty much, and people were actually reading the text. So now they needed it, because in the past when it was mnemonics, what could I do? It was hard, but I could roll the scroll out and, it's approximately this part of the scroll, and then I could look down it and find it, right? Because I memorized the whole thing. But now people are reading. They're not memorizing, they're reading it, right? So now I'm like, well, if I don't know where Judges 15 is, I'm toast. Because how am I going to find it? Try taking your Bible and getting rid of all spaces and getting rid of all vowels if you're Hebrew, right? And now try to read it. Okay? Yeah. And hat, no vowels. Hat, hut, hit, het. Which one is it? Uh-oh. Better be in context. Anyway, okay, 31. By faith, this is NIV, by faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Okay, by is added, faith, peace is persuaded, the, hope, harlot, porne, a strumpet, literally. It's a female, porne is both, in Greek, is both female and male. This is the female form, so a strumpet. Rahab, perished. Perished. Sunapole, to destroy in company with. This is that word, sunapole. Sunapole. To destroy in company with, not. With them that, it's just the. Believe not. Apatheo. See, apatheo. Where's it? Apatheo. Why did I lose it? I-T-H-E-O. Apatheo. The reason this is an important word. A is not. Pieces.
Not persuaded.
Not persuaded. Not persuaded. Matter of fact, that's, okay. That's not a primary message of Hebrews, but it's an important message of Hebrews. The important message of Hebrews is that you're supposed to tell others about the gospel, about Jesus, right? But the keynote is you are going to those who are apatheo. In the past, this isn't a thing, God does what God does, right? It's not something against God, but in the past, how did God solve the problem of apatheo? Yeah, with Noah, right? Those who were not persuaded that God was going to do the world, it just, sayonara, right? And when the children of Israel came into the promised land, how did God solve the problem? Well, I'll see you, right? God said, I'll see you, we'll work it out, but right now, this is the important point. The thing in the gospel era, right? And the Lutherans like to say law and gospel. So in the law era, it's like you're toast. In the gospel era, we have a Savior, right? And the Savior is for everyone, and that's what Hebrews is all about. Hebrews is all about, obviously, the God of Israel would work for, remember what's really interesting? The God of Israel would work for you if you were not an Israelite, if you were a stranger, right? But what did you have to do?
Be convinced.
Well, not just be convinced, you had to do it, right? If you were if you wanted to be in Israel or the land of Israel, could you continue practicing your other gods? No. What would happen? You're done, right? It says, welcome the alien among you, but the caveat to that is they had to follow the law, right? Exactly. In the Christian era, Teen Hodos era, we accept, God accepts people through Jesus Christ, the sacrifice of Christ, which is this is theological, but it's historical theology, so I guess we're safe. But that's the point. So it says, to destroy in company with them that were not persuaded. When she had received, dekomai, to receive. Remember I told you lambano is to take, dekomai is to receive. So it's interesting that we like to mess those words up. The kataskopos, the scouts, the kataskopos. So they weren't spies per se, they were scouts according to the Greek. With a mid-arena, a mid-piece. So here's a literal translation. Persuaded, the prostitute Rahab was not destroyed in company with those who were not persuaded. She received the scouts amid peace. And a translation is that persuaded, the prostitute Rahab received the scouts amid peace and was not destroyed in company with those who were not persuaded. That's the point, right? And what's interesting, you notice, who do we have? Okay, before to be persuaded, Did we have any other females, women that were persuaded before? I think we did, didn't we? Was there anyone else?
About Ruth?
No, Ruth wasn't in that thing.
Well, it looks like it's just all males.
It's all guys until we get to Rahab.
Deborah?
What's that?
Those were judges, that's after.
Yeah, Judges later than this. I don't think any, remember back, I should have reviewed it, but I don't think we had any others.
The Abraham thing is just mentions him and Isaac.
Well, I told you Sarah has mentioned a little bit of that. She wasn't persuaded though, right? But I don't think she was persuaded, but she did. Because Abraham was persuaded. Do you see where we're going here though, right? So we had all those that were persuaded, and you say, well, I expected them to be kind of persuaded. I told you shouldn't expect that. But then we got to the point where the walls of Jericho were persuaded. The spirits, the gods and goddesses were persuaded. And now we have not just a woman, a very interesting woman. Why is this interesting?
She was a prostitute.
She wasn't Hebrew.
She wasn't Hebrew.
She wasn't Hebrew. She was a prostitute for a foreign god. And they saved her whole family, not just her, but everyone that belonged to her.
Well, she had heard about that before this got.
She had.
Right.
But the thing that's really important about this, and I think the thing we miss, okay, in the patriarchal society, which I tell you is not a bad thing. When you live in might makes right, you want a strong guy to protect you and your children, okay? I don't care who you are. Rahab, however, was an independent woman. She was the head of her household, right? Under a patriarchal society, she was independent of any man. So she could make a decision legally on her own. Now, the Egyptian law allowed for that. The Israeli law didn't allow it quite as much. But later on, the Greek and Roman, especially the Roman law, allowed women to make own decisions and be head of household. But you see what the writers are telling you. Not just men can be persuaded. Who else can be persuaded? Not just women, but a woman who is an independent woman. She doesn't require, God doesn't have to go to you and say, I want to persuade you, and you go persuade your wife. Or to go to Adam and say, Adam, persuade Eve. Remember? The Orthodox position about Eve is the peak of creation, right? Adam, if Eve had just eaten of the tree of knowledge, everything would have been copacetic. Do you see this? God would have said, cool. But what was the problem? She was persuaded, and who persuaded Adam? Which means Eve was acting not just independently, but she was by her own. And what this is doing from a societal cultural standpoint, it's saying that, ladies, you don't have to have a husband to be persuaded by God. That's not to say you shouldn't have a husband. Rahab obviously was not living in a perfect situation, right? But it's saying, the writers are obviously saying to this culture, because by the way, okay, how is the only way a woman can be independent in these ancient cultures?
Widowed.
What's that?
Widowed.
Well, they could be widowed, but even if they're widowed, they're supposed to be taken care of by their children, if they have children, or their father, right, until their father dies. That's the reason they're so destitute when they're widows, because they have no one looking out for them. The only women who are truly independent in these cultures are those who are prostitutes or have some other business going on.
Who are the tent makers that Paul hung out with? And,
Like Lydia?
yeah. And
Like
then-
Lydia, the purple cloth?
Yeah, purple cloth. Yeah, those people. I mean, obviously they were women that had their own business.
Remember what I said though. Under Roman and Greek law, women could own property. under Greek law, women could own property under certain circumstances, usually if they're widowed, which was not exactly the Hebrew culture, right?
But they did make some allowances.
They did. They made allowances, but it wasn't, and I told you, the Orthodox Jewish view was women are the peak of creation, right? So they should be looking in a positive way. The point of women within their culture is they need to be protected because they are the peak of creation. The Greeks and Romans weren't quite as sophisticated culturally that way. They just had laws that said women could own property. Lydia obviously owned property under who? Who gave her the right to own that property?
As her husband?
No. She was doing purple cloth.
Oh, the church.
No, not the church.
Wealthy people, wealthy.
The Romans. The only person that, okay, in the Roman era, okay, there were no purple robes. I don't care what they show in the pictures, there's no purple robes. When they say purple robe, it means there's a little piece of embroidery or a ribbon that is purple. Because the stuff was so hard to get and so difficult to find that it was only little bits. And a person who, you weren't allowed to wear it unless you were patrician rank. Patrician rank. You could have some red, but you could not have purple. Patrician rank meant that you were, in the Latin world, Roman world, you were nobility. Okay? You would not be allowed to wear that purple shirt. That's illegal. They would kill you unless you were Roman nobility. So the fact that she worked in purple and sold it, she may have been patrician class. That was one of the things in Roman things that women could own property if they were patrician class. But she obviously had a business, and she's making buku bucks. That's big money. So Lydia is a great example. I think if they were writing about New Testament, women who are persuaded, Dorcas, Lydia, there's a whole bunch of women that would be on that thing. But that's what we see in the New Testament era, right? In the New Testament era, who did Jesus appear to? Who did the resurrected Christ appear to? Women. And they didn't believe him, right? He appeared to women, and they're like, well, we don't believe you. You're crazy. What's wrong with you? You been drinking? You know? You've been in that, what are you doing, right? But yet, women are a key point. And so, it shouldn't be unusual to us that Rahab, is one who was persuaded. Yes, sir.
And also, she was Gentile. So isn't he also making the plea that a Gentile, a non-Jew, could be persuaded?
That's beautiful. And the segue to that is, remember at the beginning, everybody was a Gentile until Abraham.
Well,
Right.
actually until Israel.
Well, until Israel. Abraham was a Gentile. Well, he was picked, persuaded, right? All those guys were Gentiles until really you get to Moses. Because when you get to Moses, now you have the Mosaic law and the Mosaic covenant, right? So you couldn't have the Mosaic covenant really until you got to Moses. So this answers the great question. All these people before were Gentiles, right? And the authors made a big deal about that, if you noted. Now we had Moses, and all of a sudden, who's the first person persuaded after Moses? Rahab. A Gentile woman who's independent. The most important thing was that God controls the gods, right? The stones of Jericho flew down because God persuaded them. And now, because Rahab was persuaded, a Gentile woman, that, okay, we're Gentiles, right? There's hope for us. Men, women, whatever, there's hope for us. Let's go on. Joshua's chapter 2. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent his message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. And you can read the whole thing, but basically, Yeah, she knew, she had heard about it, they know about it, the people were afraid because of these, the Israelites, etc., and they promised to protect her. So let's go on to 32. So rabbinic context, you need to read that yourself. But it's all good stuff. It all fits within the context. 32, this is the NIV. Now what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Just before we go any further, it started at the beginning, right? Who was the first one persuaded? I don't remember. Anybody got a note?
Abel,
Cain and Abel? Was it Adam?
by faith we understand the universe, and Abel
Yeah,
offered
Abel
the
offered.
Abel.
verse 4.
Okay, so we had Abel. We went through all those who were persuaded until we got to the spirits of the world, and Rahab. Okay, remember I told you, the peak of creation was Eve. Who's still the peak of creation? A woman. A woman is the last one persuaded in the list. This is really important because the point of inclusivity, of the point of the authors for inclusivity, you notice each of the groups. I told you, they're writing Romans, Greeks, Hebrews, Egyptians, Teen Hodos. And in each of these groups, you see the representation historically, not necessarily to the groups, purely to the groups, but you can see how the Egyptians are portrayed, right? How they're working with the Egyptians. They're trying to build this synthesis, I guess you'd say. But each of the persuaded goes up and up and up and up, and then we have the walls of Jericho, the spirits, literally the spirits that caused the wall to fly down, and we have Rahab. And then 32, NIV says, what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. Why? Why did he stop there? Maybe we'll parse it, and you think about it as we parse it. And Kai, what tis is what, shall I is added, more ethi yet. Say, Lego, argue, for, gar, assigning a reason, the chronos, the fate of the gods, space and time, would fail epilipo, to leave upon to be insufficient for me, it's eggy form, to tell, digimoi, to relate fully, to lead through, of peri, through all over, Gideon, and it's te both also of Barak, and of his added Samson, and of his added Jephthah, of his added David, also te also, and Kai, Samuel, and Kai of Samuel was it? Samson, and Kai have added the prophets, a foreteller. So here's a literal. And what yet argue? Assigning a reason, the fate of the gods, to leave upon to be insufficient for me to relate fully, to lead through all over, Gideon, also Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, Daniel, David also, and Samuel, and the prophets, the foretellers. So here's a translation. And what argues more? What argues more? Assigning a reason, the time of the gods is insufficient for me to relate fully all about Gideon, also Barak, and Samson, and Jephthah, David also, Samuel, and the prophets. Why did he stop? Why did he list? There's a bunch of other people who were persuaded.
One would hope that the case had been made up to this point, the people would have gotten it by now. Maybe a way to save some time, save some expense.
They always want to save space and time. I agree. Because remember, the writing is very expensive. Remember, I was looking up for one of my blogs, I was writing about this writing thing. Remember I've told you that a document was equal to the value of a 40-acre farm? Okay? How much do you think a Torah scroll, a real Torah scroll, costs today? If it's used and not too good, $20,000. If it's a brand new one, it's $55,000. In some places, that would buy a 40-acre farm. That cost may have decreased slightly, but it's not decreased much. So in the ancient world, the time of the ancient world, a scroll cost that much. $30,000, $40,000 per scroll. Okay? And you had to have a scroll slave, right? Until the era of reading. About 600 AD, you had to have a scroll slave. So you got a scroll slave worth about $10,000, $20,000. Average cost. Books pretty expensive. 40-acre farm, right? What argues more? Sign of reason, the time of the gods. The time of the gods is insufficient. For me to relate fully all about Gideon, Barak, etc., Samuel and the prophets. I think it's important to note. In our translation, the NIV, it says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell." That's not what it says. It says, assigning a reason the time of the gods is insufficient. Why is the time of the gods insufficient for them to fully relate? He could do it, right? He could do it, but why? In that time and in this time, now this time is theological, I'm sorry, but in that time it's historically theological. Who else is persuaded? Everybody they're writing to, right? Everybody who's hearing this. Well, everyone who's hearing it is either pisteo, persuaded, or apatheo, not persuaded, right? Everyone. Romans, Greeks, Hebrews, Egyptians, Tinoros. If you're hearing Hebrews, you are either in the persuaded group or in the not persuaded group. The point of Hebrews is they want those who are in the not persuaded group to come into the persuaded group. This is why it's not that he doesn't have enough time. The time of the gods. In other words, the gods themselves would not have time. Chronos. The god, and plus, this is kind of a joke too, right? The word Chronos means the fate of the gods. And the fate of the gods was they were thrown down like the stones of Jericho. Get it? I mean, that's why the preceding verse, remember, it's a logos to telos. It's a logos to telos, to an unstated telos. And there's a joke. There's jokes throughout this thing. It's beautiful jokes. It's entertainment. It's entertaining jokes. Because the writers are not trying to make you laugh, but they're trying to go, they're writing to sophisticated people who have really sophisticated brains, and they have sophisticated brains. And they're making these jokes because, okay, if I came out and said, death to Zeus, Jehovah is more powerful than Zeus, and Zeus is a weakling. What?
You're dead.
You're dead. You're dead on a doornail. They're going to kill you, okay? That's why they killed Socrates. Socrates didn't even say he supported the gods. He just kind of made fun of them, right? And they killed him for it. So they would kill you. But if I write that the walls of Jericho were persuaded and flew down, everybody knows what I'm saying, but I can get away with it, right? Just the same way the New Testament writers, you notice how they, remember when we were going through Matthew, we were going through Mark, and in every case I showed you how almost every other paragraph, it was a statement against the gods, and how Jesus was more powerful than the gods. He defeated the curse of Zeus, in Simon Peter's wife or mother or whatever, right? So you see that in each case they are doing a side, it's total Greek. It's a logos to unstated telos, and you're supposed to get it, right? In every case, they're attacking that. And what argues more? Assigning a reason the time of the gods is insufficient for me to relate fully about all these guys and the prophets. But the most important thing is, the last one persuaded was Rahab, the peak of creation, a woman. As a matter of fact, if you want to say, God is is not, okay, did they say a negative word about Rahab anywhere? I mean, she's doing what she can in that culture to be able to survive, right? It's just a very interesting thing, I think. I'm not saying that God is saying prostitution is okay. I think that's probably a negative, especially in modern cultures. But the point should be taken. It should be obvious to us, right? This person, Rahab, is the peak of this end. Matter of fact, if you want to put it this way, who is not as important as Rahab? David, Samuel, Samson, Barak. None of them are as important as Rahab. I mean, you could really get deep in that, but you know, that would probably be worth a study in itself for something. Okay, 33. This is the NIV. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions. All right, so what the author is doing is continuing. So let's see, in the Hebrew, in the Greek. Hos, who, through is dia. Dia is basically through, but it's all through. Pistis, persuasion. Subdued. Kata gonizeamai, to struggle against basilia, royalty. Not just kingdoms, but royalty. Rot, ergazomai, to toil. Diakosune, righteousness. Obtained, epitukano, to chance upon. Evangelia, the message of the gods. Phareso, to fence or enclose, the is added. Stoma, the mouth of lions. So literally this says, who through persuasion struggled against royalty, toiled equity, chanced upon the message of the gods, the gospel, and fenced mouths of lions. Translated, who through persuasion struggled against royalty, toiled equity, chanced upon the gospel, fenced lions' mouths. If you like, okay, you can apply these two groups, but they also are concrete, so therefore they apply to specific people. People. We'll see if we can find the specific people. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question back to Rahab. What is the big picture, the importance of Rahab, the big picture of Rahab?
Well, the big picture is that she was the most important person who was persuaded in that persuasion. You know, each of the persuadeds. She is obviously, you leave the last for the most important, especially in Greek. So she is the most important in that whole train. But she's important because she represents a woman and an independent woman. So therefore not one that has a father or a husband or a son that she has to apply for permission to. So Rahab in the big picture, the whole of that persuasion is a build-up to Rahab. And then all of a sudden the author goes, I've covered it all. So with Rahab, the authors are telling you in Hebrews, this is the most important persuasion. I finished all the important reasons, my arguments for Atellus, for unstated conclusions. And so they want us to figure it out, conclude it on our own, right? So that's the conclusion.
Which is, she can have access to more people because she was a prostitute. That means she could access more people to get what she was persuaded.
Well, no, I say more that she can appropriate God's promises, which they'll talk about, right? The promises of God was eventually the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? Jesus Christ. So what she did allows her to appropriate that. So you're not excluded if you're a Gentile, like us. We're all Gentiles. You're not excluded if you're a woman, right? You're not excluded if you're a Gentile man, or a Greek man, or a Roman man, right? You are not excluded if you're not circumcised. So the inclusivity of this is powerful, right? And the fact that Rahab is the last and most important one says that. Because she was persuaded, she can appropriate the gospel, right? And that's the whole point of Hebrews. Does this apply? And the answer is, yeah, it applies even if you're a woman, even if you're a Gentile, even if you're whoever you are, right? That's what's important to these people. Anyway, we'll continue next week. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.